All right, now we're going to move into section 3 and talk about the Franks. Now, the first two sections we talk about the Byzantine Empire and Islam. In both cases, those heirs or people that inherited something from Rome, territory, ideas, what have you, they're considered to be the heirs of Rome. But now we're moving on to the third heirs of Rome, which is in the territory of the western part of the Roman Empire. And these are the Germanic kingdoms. And in particular, we're going to focus on the Franks. Now, it should be noted that we've been discussing these heirs of Rome that have moved out of the ancient world and are now moving into the early Middle Ages with this group. So before you continue, here's what I want you to do. I really want you to think just for a moment. Pause it, do something, and think about when you hear the term Middle Ages, what kind of comes to mind, okay? So you can pause it and just kind of think about that. So now that we kind of have taken just a moment there to look at this, if you thought about it or wrote it down, you could probably filter these ideas into two categories. You can filter this, what you think about the Middle Ages, into what we call like the Robin Hood Disney version of Middle Ages, or I guess you would, maybe even like the Game of Thrones version of the Middle Ages. You have knights in shining armor and princesses and, castles and sort of these positive images that we associate with Middle Ages. Or you may list something in the opposite category, which, is kind of the Monty Python version, which, it may be, I don't know how you would, what's the cultural reference on that, but, more of this dark, depressing kind of Middle Ages view. So you may have even written down like plague and warfare, disease, death, all these negative things that we have about the Middle Ages. And this is the reason why we really want to look at this, because there are two major competing viewpoints of the Middle Ages, and I want to propose to you that both of them are kind of accurate depending on which time of the Middle Ages you are looking at. In fact, as we go forward, most of our focus from this point onward is going to be focused on the Western Empire in Western Europe. So if you look at the Middle Ages in Western Europe, you really start to think of it as taking a giant roller coaster ride at some point. You're going to start off and life is going to be good. You're at the top of the roller coaster, but we all know what happens. All of a sudden, the roller coaster takes a dive and everybody screams in terror and they're hurtling towards the ground. They get to a low point and then they slowly rise back up again, only to be screaming in terror moments later. And that essentially is what it's like to live through the Middle Ages in Western Europe. Or as far as, I think about it, there are times in the Middle Ages where it does seem like, Disneyfied version of life, where it's all good, and there's all these other times where it's more like the terrible dark version, which isn't quite as nice or pleasant to live through. But it means we have to be careful talking about, taking just one point of view on the Middle Ages and extending throughout the whole period. Now, you may have heard of the Dark Ages being used as a term for the Middle Ages, and that's kind of referring to this more dark kind of version, this more, I guess, evil kind of Game of Thrones depressing version of the Middle Ages. And it looks like, the medieval period at the time is very depressing. People are caught up in superstition. There's not any education. Everybody's kind of bad off. But as we just noted, that is kind of not the image that's appropriate for the entirety of the Middle Ages. In fact, a great portion of the Middle Ages really isn't dark at all. But you could probably aptly, term the Dark Ages to the early Middle Ages in Western Europe. If there is a time of darkness during this medieval period, that's when it is. And that's because the Roman armies pull out of Western Europe and the Roman power collapses. What we start to see happen in Western Europe is that cities begin to decline. People leave the cities because they're less safe. They start moving out to the countryside. Travel is less safe. Trade networks break down. People are going to, go to more of a local system in terms of trade, a barter system that we see. We also see the disappearance of ancient literature. Part of it's because they aren't able to continue to educate people, and so people, or at least not as many people, can read or write. But also we find that there are Germanic barbarian groups that cause an increase in warfare, and sometimes the literature is destroyed during these wars. And then, as we see, there's also a lack of education. So all these things are working together in the Middle Ages to kind of create this darker, Dark Age time frame. But it's really not appropriate to say that that terminology refers to the entirety of the medieval period. Major goals in the early Middle Ages, and really throughout the Middle Ages, is, to be quite honest, that there's a desire to return to the idea of Rome. Europeans are kind of, in a way, on a quest to restore the prosperity of the Roman Empire and also the political stability. And even though the early Middle Ages can sometimes be considered a dark age, there are kind of breakthroughs of light that go into the darkness. And we start to see movement towards regaining some sense of political stability. And this is occurring in the kingdom of the Franks. And so we need to turn and look at the founder of the Frankish kingdom, a man by the name of Clovis. So it's King Clovis who is going to unite the Franks, a Germanic barbarian group. And he's going to create a new line of Frankish kings. They're known as the Merovingians. You don't really need to know their name, but he unites the Franks together and creates a new dynasty, and this would bring some stability. But it's also important to note here that Clovis is not Roman. He is Germanic. So his style of rule is going to be borrowing from Germanic culture. In particular, the style of rule that Clovis sets up is Germanic warband kind of practice of rule. So under the terms of Germany, warbands, the king keeps the loyalty of his warband by providing gifts to the warband. In return, the soldiers in the warband will continue to fight for that king. This should sound a little bit familiar because it has similarities to the Roman patron-client system, where Roman patrons provided their clients with financial, career, legal assistance, and in return, the clients provided, their patrons with political support. And so you can kind of see this similar relationship being built here. The king gives his gifts to his warband. That's usually, comes from the spoils of war. When the king, attacks and creates, more territory, he will share out of those spoils of war with his followers, the warband. And this keeps them loyal to the king. Now, for those of you that have an interest in literature, I know all of you just love this so much, you can think of the epic poem of Beowulf. Yeah, which kind of dates to around this early medieval period. In the poem, Beowulf goes to fight for King Hrothgar, and remember how King Hrothgar gives him gifts. He gives him the sword and the rings and other kinds of gifts, and in return, Beowulf agrees to fight Grendel, the monster of the story. And so you're sort of seeing this bit of, how this dramatic warband relationship works out. Clovis will use this relationship to really good effect. He will make major conquests. And you look at this map and you see how he expands his territory in what is now modern-day France. And he's going to be able to do that because of the expansion. He is giving gifts to his warband, and they continue to remain loyal to him. Oh. King Clovis is also going to introduce various Germanic concepts into the existing Greco-Roman culture that is already in Western Europe. We see more of these Germanic elements coming into play when he establishes Salic law. So some of these Germanic elements include the practice of the bear guild, and a monetary payment that you could make to an individual if you had injured or killed that individual. It was this very guild that was based on the concept in Germanic society that everybody in society had particular value. You could basically put a price tag on them. Sometimes I refer to their guild as a person's honor price within Germanic society. Now, the higher up you are in class structure, the higher your price is going to be. So gender also played a role in this with the same social structure. Let's say we're going to use farmers as our example. The male farmer would have a higher price than a female farmer would. So they both belong to the same social class, but the man's going to have a larger price than a woman. And the purpose of the Bear Guild was to prevent blood feuds from breaking out. So if there was a conflict, let's say, I went up to you and broke your nose, and this was going to just get into a fight or something like that, or I was angry at you, so I broke your nose, you might get really mad at me, and you might decide to come, and maybe you would break my nose or my arm as well, and then I would, get really mad at you, and I would probably, because my arm is broken, I would tell somebody to go do something for me, and they might come and kill you, and your family would then come kill one of my members of my family, and you would see how quickly this would get out of hand very quickly. So the Bear Guild is really set up so that in cases where there was an injury or death, the person could simply pay the honor price or a portion of the honor price, and That would be the extent of the issue. So this is basic. This is particularly dramatic concept, though. If you go back and look at the Code of Hammurabi, though, you see that this is coming into play in the Code of Hammurabi, where, a person, if they injure a person at a lower class, you simply pay them money. And there are certainly parallels between the two. Another thing that we see is trial by ordeal. So in the early Middle Ages, we don't have CSI or anything like that. So how do you determine a person's guilt or innocence if you can't use forensics? Well, what you can do is you can ask the gods to intervene. So in some cases, a person would undergo a trial by ordeal to let the gods prove their innocence. And there was a lot of ordeals you could undergo. The most common of those was the ordeal of or the ordeal of fire. And in boiling water, you would basically put your hand into a pot of boiling water and pull out a stone. Or you take a hot piece of metal out of the fire and carry it, several paces. And in both cases, your hands would end up getting burned. So they would wrap the hand up and come back several days later and check on the hand. And if the hand had healed up, it was a sign you were innocent. And the gods had declared that you were innocent because of, but then if it was all like gross and yucky and infected, that was a sign you were guilty. Yeah, this is a terrible system. And then they knew you were guilty. Now, one of the coolest ones, one of the funnest ones, I guess, if you had to do a trial by ordeal, the Anglo-Saxons had one that was really kind of interesting. They called it ordeal by cake. And what you did was, if you were accused of a crime, you were like, I didn't do it. They'd be like, no, how are we going to prove it? And you'd be like, I would like to do an ordeal by cake. And so they would bring you a piece of cake or a cookie or something, and then you had to eat it. And if you didn't choke on it while you were eating it, you were innocent. And that's pretty funny. You'd be like, I broke the law, but I'm hungry, so I'm going to ask for cake. It really was bad, though, if you had like dry mouth for some reason, and then you choked on cake, even if you were innocent. That was kind of a bad deal, but nonetheless. Another aspect coming out of the Salic law is that in the German culture, all males would inherit equally from their fathers. So this would mean that fathers would split up their land, split up their possession among the male children that they had produced. The other thing we see about Clovis is not only is he introducing Germanic ideals, but he also starts to create a fusion between these Germanic ideals and the existing Roman culture at the time. We see that Clovis kind of grafts himself into the existing Roman culture when he converts to Roman Christianity. He does this largely because of the influence of his wife, who's a Christian, and she continues to tell Clovis that he should be a Christian. At first, he begins to follow the Arian heresy, but his wife keeps saying, no, you need to follow Orthodox Christianity. And finally, the story goes that Clovis is ready to get into a big fight, a big battle, and he starts praying to God. God gives him a major victory. He says to his wife, fine, God's given me this victory. He's clearly strong and powerful. I will convert. So he converts to Roman Catholicism, Roman Christianity. We see from this point forward that the kings of Europe start developing relationships with the Christian church. That's also going to bring about a measure of political stability in Europe. Later kings set up new administrative position known as the mayor of the palace. Originally, the job of the mayor of the palace was to be in charge of the king's household, but over time, we start to see the men who hold this position, they start to increase their power, and by the time we get to the 7th century, people like Charles Martel take their position as the mayor of the palace, and they use it to become the power behind the throne. So Charles Martel is the mayor of the palace for the area of Austrasia here. One of the things that he does is to expand his powers. He starts taking over military command to assist the Merovingian king. And so Charles Martel, who leads the army, and he asks for help, and he ends up with the nickname of the Hammer. And so he has the nickname Charles the Hammer because he tends to hammer his opponents with the military every time he goes out to meet them. And in fact, Charles Martel is very interesting because he's one of the few military commanders that we know in history has a winning record. He never loses a battle. The most important battle that Charles Martel fights is the Battle of Tours in 732. And Tours, you can see, is here in France, modern-day France. So what had happened was the Moorish army, now the Moors are Muslim. So the Muslim army had come up from Spain, was kind of raiding, exploring the area of southern France. Martel hears about this from some of the mayors of the palaces there, and he goes to their assistance. Now, notice it's Charles Martel that's making this very important decision. He's not asking the king. And this is because Martel has essentially taken over the basic responsibilities of kingship, and it has reduced the king to nothing more than a figurehead. But Charles Martel takes the army, he defeats the Muslims at the Battle of Tours, and with this, Martel is seen as the protector of Christianity in Europe. It's very interesting to wonder what would have happened if Charles Martel had lost this particular battle. Would it have allowed the Muslims to go in and conquer parts of northern Europe? We just don't know. But certainly the fact that they were defeated at Tours, and then there are some other battles that are fought that are a little smaller in southern France, all of these victories on the part of the Frankish Christian individuals keeps the Muslim from being able to expand into Europe. Martel was content to have all the powers of the king, but not his title. Martel would simply remain the mayor of the palace during his lifetime. His son Pepin the Short wasn't quite as interested in just being the power behind the throne. And he happens to expand upon his father's military victories by helping the papacy defeat the Lombards in Italy. Remember, it was the Lombards that came in and took Italy away from the Byzantine Empire. So after defeating the Lombards, Pepin hands the territory over to the Pope, and in gratitude, Pope Stephen II crowns Pepin as king of the Franks, and this establishes a new dynasty in the Frankish kingdom. We now have the rule of the Carolingian monarchs, named after Charles Martel, and so what we see happening here is that there is a transition of power that's taken place. But the most famous of the Carolingian kings would be Charlemagne, who we'll talk about in a future lesson. There are the Germanic kingdoms and the Franks in particular, so they are very important to the Middle Ages history. First off, I think that what we see happening in the western part of the Roman Empire is that these Germanic kingdoms emerge. What they're doing is they're combining Roman and Germanic culture. We see a lot with King Clovis bringing Germanic elements into law, but also the concept of war bands into politics. The other thing that we see happening is that there's a spread of Christianity during this time. Gradually, these Germanic pagans are converting to Christianity. Again, it was Clovis as the example that we look at in this lesson. He eventually converts to Roman Christianity, and after the king converts, many of his people in his kingdom would quickly follow suit and convert as well. With the conversion of these Germanic groups to Christianity, one of the things that we see happening is that Christian bishops take on political as well as spiritual roles. We can see this is a little bit in the example of Pope Stephen II, who's Bishop of Rome, getting himself involved in politics when Pepin the Short hands the territory over to him, and he names him king. And so the church is playing a bigger role in politics of these emerging Germanic kingdoms. The final thing we see is there's a major theme that we will come back to throughout our lesson as we look at life in the Middle Ages, that there appears to be this kind of quest, that people, the Middle Ages, are going on that is going to revive the political stability, the economic prosperity of the Roman Empire. Now, we know from having just studied that time period of the Roman Empire, it wasn't always political stability, and certainly not always economically prosperous. But the Middle Ages, there's a sense that they've lost something with the collapse of Rome. And especially in the Western Empire, there's going to be this desire to continually try to recreate Rome and get back to what the people see as the glory days of society. So this is one of the themes that we're going to see increasingly as we move through our lessons about medieval Europe. Thank you for watching this lecture. There's 2 more on the heirs of Rome that we will be getting to. The next one will be Charlemagne.